Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Namaste, assalamu alaikum. Good evening, good night, or good morning to all of you. We are pleased to have people in this meeting from all parts of the world in different time zones, and we wish Eid Mubarak to all our Muslim brothers and sisters. And we have a song to play to celebrate this occasion. And Dr. Mahabir will play the song. This is a Suriname version of a song originally from Trinidad, redone by Sharda Ahmad Ali in 2006, and the music was rearranged by Riaz Ahmad Ali. Kumar?
अफसोस तो रुखसत हुआ माहे मुबारक अलविदा रो रो के दिल ने यूं कहा माहे मुबारक अलविदा अफसोस तो रुखसत हुआ माहे मुबारक अलविदा रो रो के दिल ने यूं कहा माहे मुबारक अलविदा मुद्दत से थी हम मुंतज़िर शुक्र खुदाया तो फिर शुक्र खुदाया तो फिर ऐसे जल्दी चल दिया माहे मुबारक अलविदा अफसोस तो रुखसत हुआ माहे मुबारक अलविदा कुरान भी नाज़िल हुआ हमको शारुख हासिल हुआ कुरान भी नाज़िल हुआ हमको शारुख हासिल हुआ हमको शारुख हासिल हुआ है हाय मैं काफिर रवा माहे मुबारक अलविदा अफसोस तो रुखसत हुआ माहे मुबारक अलविदा पढ़ते थे कलाम रोज़ सब कहते थे सुभान लोग सब कहते थे जुबान लोग सब हर लफ्ज़ पर रहमते खुदा माहे मुबारक अलविदा अफसोस तो रुखसत हुआ माहे
Thank you. We also wish to say that Hindus are also celebrating Navratri from today in honor of the 9 forms of Mother Durga. And Christians are also observing and fasting the period of Lent. And in Trinidad and Tobago, the Shouter Baptist community is also celebrating their Spiritual Baptist Liberation Day today. So we honor everyone. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago, a teacher for the past 17 years. And ladies and gentlemen, this is the 253rd edition of our ICC Thought Leaders Forum. We wish to sincerely thank all of you who have contributed in whatever way to the success of this ongoing Pan-Indo-Caribbean and Pan-Indian Diaspora Global Project. For 252 unbroken continuous weeks, we have been here every single Sunday. And in the past 4 years, 10 months, and 2 weeks, we have featured 1,233 presenters from all parts of the world speaking on 252 topics. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a weekly forum being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, a legally registered research and publishing company operating since 2010. And like today, we often partner with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the Study of Indentureship and its Legacies, led by Professor David Dabydeen. And we wish to have this program today in honor of Amina Ghafoor. In order to continue this weekly program and to make it bigger and better, we are asking for suggestions and volunteers. If you give a donation, your name will be placed on our poster and all promotional materials, and you can contact Dr. Kumar Mahabir for details. We are within the preparation mode for our ICC nonprofit group tour of Guyana for the Easter from April 14 to the 23rd, and also planning for a conference and a tour of South Africa from August 2nd to 14th this year. And we will schedule an entire program on this planned visit to South Africa for next Sunday. So I'll introduce our moderator today, who is Shalma Mohammed, the co-director of this ICC Zoom platform and researcher from Trinidad and Tobago. She obtained her master's degree in business psychology from Franklin University in the USA. Shalma, welcome.
Thank you so much, Shakir. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Namaste. And a warm welcome to all of you. I want to say Eid Mubarak. Greetings to everyone on the occasion of Spiritual Baptist Liberation Day. And I want to thank all of you all for choosing to be here with us on what is considered to be Navratri, or if you are in South India, it is Ugadi. It's a very festive season. We are also in the period of Lent. And so today is very significant for us. This program is being recorded on Zoom and live streamed on the YouTube channel of the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center. Welcome to all of you on YouTube at this time. To avoid intrusions from trolls, we've decided to allow members of the public to view and participate in the program via YouTube. And ordinarily, it would be wonderful to have you all on Zoom where we can exchange our greetings and we can have messages back and forth on the chat. Unfortunately, we have had some terrible instances with the trolls. And so if you wish to enter the Zoom room, we are asking you to please send a request to Dr. Mahabir via his WhatsApp number. I want to thank you so much for your understanding and cooperation. Today, we are talking about liberated and indentured Africans and the Indian diaspora. And one of the reasons is because there would have been a relationship between these particular persons who experienced liberation and indentureship who were from Africa and persons who were indentured from India. Liberated Africans were enslaved individuals who were freed by British naval forces during the 19th century in an effort to suppress the transatlantic slave trade. So we would like to find out, well, where were the liberated Africans resettled and what was the relationship between they and other Africans who were resettled? After the abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833, there was a labor shortage in colonies such as Trinidad, British Guyana, and Jamaica, and several others. Between the 1830s and 1860s, some Africans were recruited into indentured labor systems to fill the gap. Indentured Africans, like indentured Indians, entered into labor contracts. In exchange, what did these indentured Africans receive? Did they receive return passage, wages, or land? Were the labor contracts of indentured Africans misleading promises, as was the case for the indentured Indians? How different was the working conditions under indentureship from slavery for the African? To what extent did the liberated and indentured African enjoy freedom of movement? Ladies and gentlemen, we'll hear from our esteemed panel of speakers. And I want to welcome our first speaker today, who is Professor Richard Allen of the USA. He's the author of over 70 publications on Mauritian social and economic history, indentured labor in the colonial plantation world, slavery, slave trading, and abolition in the Indian Ocean world. Welcome, Professor Allen.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Nice.
Well, let me offer some comments, and specifically what I would like to do is provide some thoughts and reflections on indentured African labor in the colonial plantation world, and to do so in sort of broader conceptual terms. And this brings us back to some of the things that I've written about before in terms of indentured labor during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So this will be a little bit of a formal presentation, and so please bear with me on that score. So the migration of 3.7 million indentured laborers between the 1830s and the 1920s, and especially the 2.1 million men and women who did so under written engagements of contracts of engagement, has been a subject of scholarly interest now for more than 50 years. Despite this continuing interest, our knowledge and understanding of this migrant labor system continues to be plagued by a number of problems, which have left us with an incomplete, if not ultimately distorted, picture of this global system. And I think we do need to remember that we are talking about something here which is truly global in its scope. The first of these problems is the propensity to treat indentured migration during the 19th and early 20th century as a separate and distinctive phenomenon unto itself, a perspective which ignores the larger historical processes of which it was an integral component. A prominent manifestation of this tendency has been the practice of drawing a sharp dividing line between the pre- and post-emancipation eras in the colonial plantation world. Studies of British colonies, for example, usually end with the abolition of slavery in 1834, or occasionally with the demise of the so-called apprenticeship system in 1838, while studies of the indentured laborers who replaced slaves in colonial cane fields pay little substantive attention to the slave regimes that preceded them. A second problem stems from the preoccupation with labor recruitment, control, resistance, and accommodation, an obsession which reflects the continuing influence of Hugh Tinker's 1974 argument, which echoed some British abolitionist concerns that indentured labor was little more than a, quote, new system of slavery. A third problem is the Indocentrism, which dominates scholarly and public discourse about this system. While Indians comprised approximately 65% of the 2.1 million men and women who migrated to work under written contracts, and most of the 1.6 million who did so under oral contracts of engagement, the preoccupation with South Asian immigrants obscures the fact that hundreds of thousands of men and women from East and West Africa, China, the Comoros, Europe, Madagascar, Japan, Java, Melanesia, and Yemen also participated in this global migrant labor system. What I would like to do today is to focus on the 100,000 or more East and West Africans, Comorians, and Malagasis who participated in this migrant labor system during the mid-19th century. Their experiences highlight the need to move beyond the unidimensional discussions which dominate indentured labor studies and embrace the complexities inherent in this labor system's origins, structure, organization, operation, and legacy. Doing so requires us to transcend two major conceptual constraints which shape this field of study. The first of these constraints is what has been aptly characterized in slavery studies as the, quote, tyranny of the Atlantic, a term which reflects the preoccupation with indenture in the Atlantic world and the attendant ignorance of or disregard for important and immediately relevant developments in the Indian Ocean world. On too many occasions, historians have argued that the recourse to indentured labor, and indentured Indian labor in particular, was driven by the demand for labor in the British Caribbean colonies after the apprenticeship system ended in 1838. However, as archival research has demonstrated, this system's origins date to 1802, when Lieutenant William Layman, a Royal Navy officer with considerable experience in the Indian Ocean, proposed that Chinese laborers should be recruited to work in Trinidad, a proposal which was quickly approved by the British cabinet and implemented by the British East India Company officials in Calcutta and Penang. As Barry Higman noted more than 50 years ago in a frequently ignored article published in the Journal of Caribbean History, this first attempt involved the introduction of 200 indentured Chinese into Trinidad in 1806. Although this very first experiment failed because of worker resistance to poor living and working conditions, it established a precedent for other attempts to use Asian contractual laborers elsewhere in the British Empire and beyond. We may note, for instance, that Chinese laborers also reached Ceylon, now of course Sri Lanka, and St. Helena in the South Atlantic during the 18-teens. In 1818, Baron Pierre Bernard de Milius, governor of the French-controlled Île Bourbon, now Réunion, proposed recruiting indentured Malagasis to work on the island's estates in an attempt to undermine the illegal slave trade to the island. The late 1820s, in turn, witnessed the introduction of 4,600 Chinese and Indian indentured laborers into Réunion and Mauritius in what also proved to be unsuccessful early attempts to use such labor. A second major constraint is what I've characterized on previous occasions as, quote, the tyranny of the particular, by which I mean the reluctance to situate the specialized case studies which dominate this field of study in more fully developed local, regional, global, and comparative contexts. David Northrop signaled the need to do so 30 years ago in his classic survey of indentured labor in the age of imperialism. More specifically, Northrop argued that this global migrant labor system must be viewed in light of other large-scale migrations during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And here, of course, he was speaking particularly of the large-scale migration of Europeans to the Americas. And he also argued that indentured workers shared more in common with these millions of European migrants than they did with enslaved Africans, and that the use of indentured Africans was intimately linked to British efforts to suppress slave trading in the Atlantic. And of course, this is becoming increasingly clear with the research that is being conducted on the liberated African populations. More recent research has revealed the ways in which the slave, convict, and indentured labor trades in the late 18th and early 19th century Indian Ocean were interconnected, connections which underscore the need to contextualize the complexities of the indentured experience more fully than has hitherto been the case. The need to do so is especially true when we consider the indentured Africans who reached British and French plantation colonies in the Caribbean and the Mascarenes during the mid-19th century. More specifically, we may note that the movement of these workers to the Caribbean, which began in 1841, occurred at precisely the same time when indentured Indian immigration to British colonies had been suspended because of the abuses to which these workers had been subjected. Our knowledge about indentured African labor during the mid-19th century remains limited because of a lack of scholarly interest in it. Monica Schuller's Alas, Congo, A Social History of Indentured African Immigration into Jamaica, 1841 to 1865, which was published 45 years ago, remains the only major English language study of this population. French scholars, including Hubert Gerbeau, Sudel Fuma, and especially Francois Renaud and Jean Emmanuel Monnier, have examined the recruitment of 50,000 ostensibly, quote, liberated slaves and free contractual workers in Mozambique and Madagascar to work on Mayotte in the Comoros, the island of Nosy Bay off Madagascar's northwest coast, and Réunion between 1848 and the 1880s. However, the fact that they published their studies in French, coupled with the Atlantic centrism I mentioned before, have ensured that their work has not received the attention it deserves in a field dominated by Anglophone scholarship. Our lack of knowledge about indentured Africans is perhaps best reflected by the fact that the number of such workers who reached European plantation colonies during the 19th century has yet to be determined with any certainty. David Northrop reported that 96,032 indentured Africans were shipped from West Africa and St. Helena to British and French colonies in the Caribbean and Réunion, mostly between 1841 and 1870, and that 91,951 of them reached their destination alive, figures which suggest that these workers experienced an average mortality rate of 4.25% on the high seas, compared to an average mortality rate of 12.8% on board slave ships crossing the Atlantic at the same time. More recent scholarship indicates that the number of indentured Africans, Comorians, and Malagasys shipped to European colonies during the mid-19th century should probably be increased by at least 14,300 to a total of about 110,000 men and women, which would account for about 5.2% of the 2.1 million workers who migrated under written contracts of engagement. However, this number may be increased still further if the 97,000 workers shipped from Angola to Portugal's island colonies of São Tomé and Príncipe in the Gulf of Guinea between 1876 and 1915 are considered to be indentured rather than coerced laborers. The limited demographic information at our disposal indicates that this indentured African population shared a number of characteristics in common with other early indentured immigrant populations. As a general rule of thumb, males outnumbered females by a ratio of about 2 to 1, while a majority of these migrants were clearly young adults. In between 1854 and 1857, a French captain, Charles Chevalier, recruited 123 migrants in Sierra Leone to work in French Guiana and Martinique. And what a breakdown of these recruits reveals is that 75 or 61% of them were aged between 15 and 24. And in fact, it's worth noting that only one individual was described as being 35 years of age or older. A sample of 1,208 indentured Africans destined to the French Caribbean reveals that these workers came from various areas in West Africa, including the former slaving port of Gorée in Senegal, Freetown and the Galinas River in Sierra Leone, Monrovia, trade town in New Ceste in Liberia, and the Cape Coast, which of course was modern Ghana. More than half of the individuals in this sample came from among the crew of people who occupy what is now eastern Liberia and western and Ivory Coast. A striking feature of this indentured African migration is that only 10% of these workers relocated voluntarily to the Caribbean. That 90% of these individuals were people described as, quote, liberated Africans or prize Negroes or, quote, recaptives, speaks to the fact that when we start talking about these men and women, the old question of whether they were really free or not comes back to the surface. We are, of course, talking here about individuals who were rescued from slave ships captured by the Royal Navy, who were then carried to Sierra Leone and to St. Helena, where the ships they were on were condemned, and the courts of admiralty that passed on them deemed them to be legally free individuals. However, and I know this is where my colleagues Henry and Matt will have a great deal more to say than I do, British authorities were loath, for a variety of reasons, to let these individuals pursue their own livelihoods and resorted to the practice of, quote, apprenticing them, often for 14 years, to white planters who then they were required to work for, while ostensibly, right, either learning or being taught a, quote, responsible craft, trade, or other occupation. Unfortunately, we know comparatively little about these workers' lives. It's true that Monica Schuler discusses many of the features of the lives that people who reached Jamaica experienced, but otherwise, the indentured African experience remains very much a cipher. Attempts by Céline Flory and Satyendra Peltham to reconstruct the biographies of migrants from Sierra Leone and liberated Africans in Mauritius, respectively, have shed at least marginal light on some individuals' life histories. But these exercises, unfortunately, have not really addressed important questions about the indentured African experience in its totality. And I would suggest to you here quite strongly that this is precisely what we need to do. The need to do so is mandated by the fact that, of course, a great majority of these migrants remained permanently in the colonies to which they had been transported, where they became an integral part of the local population. As in indentured labor studies in general, we are left to wonder about the ways in which these indentured Africans interacted with former slaves and other immigrant populations in the colonies where they resided. We are also left to wonder about the ways in which they earned their livelihood after completing their indentures. And lastly, we're left to wonder about the ways in which they and their descendants may have created and or maintained a distinctive sense of community. Let me conclude my admittedly brief comments by noting that our current lack of knowledge about indentured Africans is emblematic of why indentured labor migration rarely figures in discussions about the origins, nature, and dynamics of the modern world in which we live. Histories of the Indian Ocean, to cite a prominent example, pay little, if any, attention to indentured labor migration, despite its obviously important role in shaping social, economic, cultural, and political life in many of the countries washed by the Mare Indicum, such as Mauritius, Réunion, Kenya, South Africa, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. The same can be said about histories of the Atlantic world, which came into existence during the 17th century and continues to be defined exclusively in terms of the notion of sugar and slaves, despite the obviously important role indentured labor has played in shaping social, cultural, and economic life in the Caribbean after 1840. Let me suggest that if we are truly serious about reconstructing the history of these men and women and the multicultural societies which they helped to create, we must embrace the indentured experience in all of its rich and fascinating complexity. Doing so will require us to shake off the intellectual complacency which permeates this field of study and set about the business of asking and addressing hitherto unasked questions about the dynamics of what was a truly global migrant labor system, in which, as I've suggested, a broad range of humanity participated, both willingly and unwillingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Allen. You've given us a very broad overview of indentureship on the whole, and you've painted a lovely picture for us to think about. I think your reference to our next two speakers is a good introduction for them. And without further ado, I'm going to bring in Professor Henry Lovejoy, a Canadian researcher, an associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and a director of the Digital Slavery Research Lab. He has published works on African indentured labor. After all our speakers, we will take some questions from the audience. I want to welcome you, Professor Lovejoy.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me here today. It's quite an honor to be able to participate in this very successful webinar. I also want to thank Dr. Richard Allen for his brief overview. And before I jump into my PowerPoint, what I will be talking about today is a website that I've developed called liberatedafricans.org. This website is quite an extensive statistical analysis of the total liberated African movement globally. So it is going to revise some of Dr. Richard Allen's comments on the scholarship and global perspective, as well as looking at the new estimates that we now have of the liberated African movement globally. So this actually relates to Eric Williams, who is, of course, the great Trinidadian scholar, and his work on slavery and capitalism. He argued that British abolition was for economic reasons and allowed for industrialization, especially in the British Empire. But the humanitarian perspectives about the suppression and abolition of the slave trade, he argued, created a distorted view of the abolitionist movement. He called it a lucrative humanity, where governments exploited a free labor force that was, in fact, not free. Abolitionist rhetoric transmits these false notions of captives being rescued, which he long forewarned is problematic because people paid for their price of freedom through compulsory labor. So when we talk about liberated Africans, we actually have a number of different names depending on the governments that were involved in these processes, because it is something that Great Britain essentially started through anti-slave trade law, most especially the 1807 Abolition Act. And other nations called them different things, such as emancipados in Spanish or libertos in Portuguese. The French had a system called rachat and engagé, where they purchased people and then indentured them after freeing them from slavery. The Dutch participated in this as well. They called them belanda hitam, and they bought them within Africa and then sent them to Indonesia to fight, to replenish their armies following the Java War. So we have these really broad terms of liberated Africans that sort of shift over time. Portuguese started as libertos and then shifted to another term called serviçais, which is essentially servants. So my definition really revolves around the people removed from slavery at sea or on land. There's a distinction that I'll get into in a second. They were condemned as property by a government and declared free under anti-slave trade law. And this whole system really led to that indentured movement from Asia and other parts of the world. It sort of opened these doors. And I find it interesting that Richard Allen brings this even earlier, and I'm very interested in some of those Higman articles and stuff like that. But under the control of the state, the so-called freed person was then subject to this period of involuntary indenture, which varied between government and changed over time. So the British had 14 years. The serviçais in the late 19th, early 20th century was only 2 years. But the transition from indenture to freedom never really transpired in many different circumstances. So by extension, other state-run schemes adopted and adapted this model to purchase people or offer them asylum from warfare and other places slavery, and then subjected them to indentures. So liberated Africans, in variations of the terms, was slavery without the name. This has long been argued since Philip Curtin's foundational census on the Atlantic slave trade. So to me, liberated African really means involuntary African indentured labor. So the new global survey that I've conducted and is now published in Past and Present, which is a historical journal from England, I've increased the global estimates of liberated Africans from about 250,000 to over 700,000 globally. This increase of enslaved people increases our numbers of people involved in the Atlantic slave trade from about 12.7 million, as shown on slavevoyages.org, to over 13 million people. It also increases the total number of indentured laborers globally, mostly from Asia, from 3.7 million to over 4 million people today. I've shown in my article that there's over 18 different governments involved in this process, including in the maritime blockade of the slave trade. So it wasn't just British Navy ships, but we also have Portuguese, we also have Dutch, we have Argentinian, we even have Ottoman, and it gets into Italian captures as well during the colonization of Africa. So this global survey also begins to show that France and Portugal actually surpassed British efforts of developing liberated Africans, especially after 1853. So this is sort of a period, and I'll show some timelines, when the British sort of stopped their suppression of the slave trade in the Atlantic world. It's coming to an end. And then there's more on-land captures, especially within Africa. During this period, and I think this has the most relevance in terms of this webinar related to Guyana and Trinidad, that over 50,000 people, liberated Africans, were sent to the British Caribbean colonies from Sierra Leone, St. Helena, Cuba, and Brazil between 1833 and 1850. So this ties into Monica Schuyler's work, but there's actually some earlier works from Monica Schuyler, such as Johnson Asiegbu's work from the 1960s that shows some of these liberated African migrations, and even earlier to the 1950s on immigration reports by G.W. Roberts. So he shows a lot of these migrations coming into the British Caribbean after 1833. And if we think about this, this is after the emancipation of enslaved people. So this creates a whole different level because we don't generally talk about these migrations from Africa, primarily Sierra Leone, St. Helena, to the British Caribbean after British emancipation. So this model of involuntary African indenture really relates to the idea of second slavery, a historical model that reinterprets slavery and capitalism as part of industrialization, the transition to wage labor, and world economic expansion in the 19th century. So this is sort of building upon Eric Williams' very famous thesis. Because after the collapse of Haiti's sugar industry in 1791 and Britain's general withdrawal from the slave trade in 1807, these new zones of slave commodity production emerged across the United States South, Cuba, Brazil, and as well as Muslim states in West Africa. So Dale Talmage has argued that slavery in these areas was complemented by other forms of labor control, which included indentured labor, wage labor, as well as peasant labor. So what I'm sort of thinking here now, because of the large scale of indentured labor, it might even be considered a third slavery that we're beginning to talk about, because these are state-run labor schemes under this misnomer of liberated African. Right? This would include all the Asian indentured laborers as well, right? Because these major centers of slave commodity production adjusted to the enforcement of anti-slave trade law via these state-run indentureship programs. So government-run schemes might be better reconceptualized as a third slavery because of their size, global reach, and prevalence into the 20th century. So when I look at all of the data that I've been collecting on liberated Africans in global perspective, what we can begin to see is that there's this transition at the mid-century where the capture of slave ships by various navies around the world resulted in the shift of indentured labor being taken on land. And this is specifically to liberated Africans. So they started rescuing, quote unquote, people from slavery, forcing them to indenture within Angola, within precursors to French colonies in Africa, and various other different places. So these huge peaks in the 1850s, results in really the Portuguese and French adapting to these policies as they're beginning to colonize Africa. So we can look at the different ways in which liberated Africans were, quote unquote, liberated, that is, being forced into these contracts of indenture. And initially it happened through this process of condemnation according to anti-slave trade law. So they would capture them as prizes, condemn them as property, and then force them into labor. And then the French adapted this policy by buying enslaved people within Africa and liberating them and forcing them into indentures. So we have this difference between the condemnation model and the purchasing model. And as colonization within Africa began to pick up a bit more, enslaved people began showing up at consulates within colonial Africa and declaring their freedom according to law. So places like this huge peak in the 1880s is really the British occupation of Egypt, when thousands of people began appearing in these consulates within North Africa to declare their freedom. So the global survey that I began conducting really shows that it's a much more complicated model than what we're just talking about in the British Atlantic world or within the British Navy. So it is possible as well to understand when and where these people came from within Africa over time. And looking at it in terms of the regional distribution of where liberated Africans originated from, we get a better sense of the different types of places. Some of this is on land. Other parts of it are related to the capture of slave ships. So you can see, for example, that West Central Africa, what is now Angola, is a very big place, following the Portuguese rules of registering all of these enslaved people and forcing them into indentures. And we're talking the size of 60,000 people. And there was large processes of registration of people, just like it was in sort of the Asian diaspora of the indentured labor movement. So we have a lot of registered individuals which on one hand is very great because we get to learn about the different people and the migrations that did occur. But these registers were really the evidence of the contracts of indenture, right? So the idea was that 14 years later, the individual could return and say, that's my name in the book. I am therefore free of my indenture. I have served my time. Now, on a large scale, this didn't happen. It wasn't always possible. People moved around and there were different settlements. So through my global survey as well, I began to document, because a lot of the time the capture of Navy ships, which was the evidence of the liberation of slavery, they documented the locations of where the slave trade blockade happened. And I've captured as many of these as possible, about 3,000 documented capture locations. And this gives you an idea of what the slave trade blockade looked like on a global scale. So these are all the capture locations of various different navies. It's not just the British. There's Portuguese captures as well. And you can explore this on the website, www.liberatedafricans.org. So this gives you an idea of what that looked like. The Spanish Navy was capturing slave ships off the coast of Cuba, for example, Portuguese off of Mozambique, and as well as Angola, as well as Cabo Verde and other places as well. So we have this very large scale blockade of the maritime slave trade, which we can now visualize in its entirety based on documented capture locations. In terms of liberated Africans in global perspective, the interactive website, which I'll discuss just very briefly, but this gives you an idea of where all of the liberated Africans trials took place, because these occurred in different legislative bodies of colonial governments, foreign offices, mixed commissions, so on and so forth. So you can begin to see the extent of where liberated Africans were captured in Brazil, where there's an extensive scholarship on libertos in Brazil, for example, looking at their lives, looking at what they've been doing afterwards, where Cuba was happening, Angola, Sierra Leone, which is Britain's main base of operations for the suppression of the slave trade. We can also see these capture locations in the Indian Ocean world, where trials were taking place in the Ottoman Empire at different points in time as well. So we have this in terms of all over the Mediterranean basin as well. It's not just in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Along the Red Sea, the Arabian Peninsula as well, which Matthew Hopper's work largely helped uncover as well. In terms of liberated African, we actually have a very large visual archive. So there's lots of imagery out there. I would anticipate at least 1,000 different types of images, including some photographs, communities of what liberated African communities looked like in the Caribbean all over the world. So part of the project as I'm moving forward is to begin to organize this visual archive in different ways. So in terms of the website, you can click on these proportional symbols, the circles on the maps, and it can lead you into specific cases, right down to sort of the registers of liberated Africans. So I'm beginning to organize all of these case files through the different global archives, many of which are online and made available digitally. I've also organized in different ways over 850 pieces of anti-slave trade legislation, because this is essentially the overriding laws that dictated how these people were liberated, the terms of their indenture. And this spanned from treaties within Africa to local laws within the United States, for example, through to bilateral treaties signed between Great Britain, Spain, or Portugal, or the Netherlands. And it really sort of encompasses the global scenario in terms of this. So this archive, you can go in, you can click on different parts of it and pull up a lot of the records. I've had graduate students help me organize and catalog all of this information. So as we begin to look at the different numbers of liberated Africans in global perspective, I organized the information based on the names of archives, because the archives generally have to do with the Foreign Office or the Colonial Office, if we're talking about Great Britain, or the Ministerio do Outro-Mar from Portugal, which is essentially the Foreign Office of Portugal, and the same for France. So all of this falls within the archival structure of these various governments. So you can begin to see the global extent based on this, where the Portuguese ended up liberating, quote unquote, over 200,000 people. I've also begun keeping track of how many of these people were registered according to each of these different governments. So you can see that some governments did, others didn't. Others were more into it, like the British or the courts of mixed commission, whether that was Anglo-Portuguese, Anglo-Dutch, Anglo-Spanish, Anglo-Brazilian, so on and so forth. So this follows a method by Leslie Bethel, who began looking at the cases rather than voyages or other things like this, because it's essentially within the legal structure of anti-slave trade law. So once we begin to break down the maps in different ways, we can see where the majority of the Portuguese Empire liberated people on a global scale. This all happened mostly within sort of the Angola side of things, although there was also other elements within Mozambique. We have different amounts of information that has survived or not survived, depending on the scholarship that we're dealing with. So we can begin to look at the Portuguese according to their different courts, right? So the Governor General of Angola was responsible essentially for 115,000 liberated Africans, the majority of whom were captured on land, not on sea. But we also have other things like the Vice Admiralty courts of the Portuguese that also liberated enslaved Africans in different places. If we switch over to the French, we can see it sort of spreading across French colonial Africa. They called these villages de liberté, villages of liberty, where they would try and keep people and indenture them within Africa. A lot of these people would run away because they didn't like the labor conditions, because it was akin to slavery. So we can see where Réunion really gets into the picture versus some of Céline Floret's work, where people are bought within West Africa and then liberated in the French Caribbean after the Second French abolition in 1848. So the French system, if we begin to look at the statistics by court or maritime court, we can begin to see that the French are heavily involved in this process as well, right? In Senegal, there's actually 27,000 people who were registered within the beginnings of French colonial West Africa. And this is a lot of work from Richard Roberts and his team at Stanford University. So we can go down the list. We can begin to think about it in terms of religious terms. The Père Blanc, who were operational in across Africa as well, who were purchasing enslaved people and liberating them as well. So once we begin to see these differences, you can begin to see the British Empire overall, right? And these primarily happened at sea. You can see the large size of Sierra Leone and the temporary liberated depot of St. Helena before people were sent to the British Caribbean from these places. And they too also had liberty farms and liberty villages within British colonial Africa. So we start to see it creeping into those areas as well. So all of these statistics, I know this might be a little hard to see on your computer screen, but it's to give you an idea how the Court of Vice Admiralty in Freetown, they liberated over, quote unquote, liberated over 38,000 people. And then the next one was St. Helena. And then Zanzibar, where there was almost 20,000 people liberated through the Vice Admiralty Court there in the Indian Ocean world. There was registrations that occurred in the Indian Ocean world as well. I've transcribed those. There's a data set online that's continuously being developed to document the names of these particular individuals. So we can look at the different mixed commissions as well, based on bilateral treaties between Britain and Britain and Spain, Britain and Portugal, so on and so forth, the big majority happening in Sierra Leone. So the statistics as well, you can begin to see broken down court by court, case by case, how many people were involved, how many people were registered. So what we really get are these different sort of periods that happen within the liberated African movement, right? The first period is sort of happening in the Napoleonic Wars. The second period is when we get into the sort of the opening of the bilateral treaties in response to the end of the Napoleonic Wars and peace happening. The third period, when the laws, the bilateral treaties begin to change. You can capture empty slave ships. They don't need people on board necessarily. And then the fourth period is sort of this transition when Portugal and France really kick in and they begin to sort of liberate more people than the British had in any previous period. And that continues mostly on land thereafter during the colonization of Africa. So you can look at it in terms of the three types of liberated Africans that I've sort of begun to loosely define: the condemnation, purchase, and asylum, and so on and so forth. Right? And these periods very much align with what we're beginning to talk about. So once we've begun to understand where these trials were taking place, they could have been very loose. They could have occurred on slave ships. They were held in fields. They could have happened anywhere. There wasn't a specific building if we think about courts today, but they happened all over the place. And now we can begin, once we understand where they were liberated, where they began to move afterwards. So if we look at Sierra Leone, for example, a lot of the registers of people tell you which settlements within the Sierra Leone Peninsula these liberated Africans ended up at. So a big majority went to Freetown, but they're sent around the peninsula in various degrees and numbers. And people would have moved around thereafter, but we know these sort of initial areas of settlements all over the place. And so Freetown, a lot of those people, about 25,000 people from Sierra Leone ended up in the British Caribbean after 1834. So the global migration of liberated Africans after their initial point of liberation is quite extensive, and it extends globally. Liberated Africans being sent from Zanzibar to Mauritius to Bombay, from different places, different admiralty courts to Mauritius, for example, from Mauritius to the Seychelles. It's a very complex global movement. So we can see too, liberated in the Atlantic world, people going from Freetown and St. Helena to various Caribbean colonies, from Cuba to various Caribbean colonies, and also liberated Africans who were liberated in Brazil heading to the British Caribbean as well. So using a lot of the scholarship based on sort of liberated African movements to the British Caribbean, and this is where I'm just coming to the end of my talk, but this is essentially what we can begin to see. How many people ended up in Jamaica or British Guyana, right? We're talking about over 10,000 liberated Africans after 1834 going to British Guyana. We talk about another 10,000 going to Trinidad after 1834. So the small numbers underneath, if you can see them, this is online on my website, this map, so you could look at it more closely. But, to Trinidad, we had 2,700 people coming from Sierra Leone, another 4,500 coming from St. Helena, 1,100 or so coming from Cuba, and another 1,100 coming from Brazil. British Guyana, over 5,000 from Sierra Leone, another 5,000 from St. Helena, and another 1,000 from Brazil. So these secondary and tertiary migrations of liberated Africans, we can get down to the level of it because of the large amount of documentation. There is actually a very large and growing scholarship about this happening globally at this point, including in the Mediterranean world, colonial Africa, where scholars are transcribing all of these registers of liberated Africans, whether it's French, Portuguese, British, Dutch, so on and so forth. The scale and scope has been so much bigger than what we've been realizing that this affects our global totals of indentured labor, whether from Asia, Africa, or elsewhere. This was a state-run system. So just to conclude, this idea of slavery without the name, it extends beyond the scope of my survey, where I stopped in 1920. This is at the foundation of the International Labor Organization following World War I. But we have evidence that this continues later. It also, after sort of 1920, marks a transition where it's state-controlled and it reprivatizes and draws us closer to what is modern-day human trafficking, where there's not a lot of documents. It's private individuals and enterprises who may or may not be working with governments on a global scale, forcing people to work in different capacities around the world, right? We still estimate that there's 50 to 60 million enslaved people in the world today, even though that proportion is much lower than it was in the past. So this global survey demonstrates the continuation of slavery under
Can
government.
you zoom on?
I'll turn it off. I've stopped people.
I'm just about finished. Sorry. The Atlantic slave trade didn't end in 1866 as we've generally believed. You know, we have liberated Africans going from Angola to San Tome and Principe, which Richard talked about briefly. This is no different than liberated Africans going from different parts of Africa to Sierra Leone or to St. Helena in different areas, right? So what do we mean by the end of the Atlantic slave trade? I don't necessarily think it ends in 1866. I also think this is really a third slavery that we're talking about if we're building upon what Talmage has said, because of the vast scope of it in global perspective, the integration of different places and people outside of Africa, right? The British Caribbean had 750,000 registered individuals at British emancipation in 1834. They were forced into indentures, although the majority of them were not born in Africa. What about the emancipation in the United States or in Brazil? These are millions of people who are involved in these indentured labor schemes following anti-slave trade law. So the scale and scope could be even bigger. We can extend it to colonial Africa and the Congo Free State. There's a parallel in terms of what governments were doing, and the scale and scope of this is much bigger than the 700,000 that I've been talking about. So the reliance on captives taken off of slave ships or seized on lands really constituted, in my opinion, this new phase of global slavery, right? It's what I believe is becoming a sort of this third slavery building upon Talmage's insights. So thank you very much. I will end it there, and I will pass it on to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lovejoy. Quite an expositive presentation, filled with so much data. We really appreciate it. Thank you. And again, we'll hold questions until our third speaker, if you don't mind. So let me introduce Professor Matthew Hopper of the USA. He's a professor of history at California Polytechnic State University, currently writing a book on the history of liberated Africans in the Indian Ocean world. Welcome, Professor Hopper.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be with you. And I'd like to thank also Dr. Allen and Dr. Lovejoy for those wonderful presentations. Those are hard acts to follow. I'll do my best. What I hope to do is talk a little bit about the book project that I'm working on. So I've been asked just to share a few minutes about the project. So I'll give sort of an overview, but maybe also try to paint a picture of what a few of those captured slave ships might have looked like. And I want to start actually with a story. So I'll open up a PowerPoint presentation. I think if this opens up correctly. I think I've selected the right one here.
You need to share screen.
Guys, has it worked? There we go. All right, great. Sorry, just a little bit different there. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'll start with a story, and I'll fill in with a couple of other stories of slave ships that were captured in the Indian Ocean. And I'll see if I can kind of connect those to what Dr. Allen and Lovejoy were just describing. So I actually want to start with a story of a ship that foundered in around Cape Town in the year 1818. It was a Portuguese ship by the name of the Paquete Real, and it was bound from Mozambique over here on its way to Brazil, to Bahia in Brazil, and it foundered in a storm while it was provisioning at the Cape of Good Hope. And there were enslaved Africans on board who were then claimed as prizes of the crown of the governor of the Cape Colony. That brig, that Brazilian brig, had departed Mozambique with 237 enslaved Africans on board, but 52 had lost their lives in the passage just to the Cape of Good Hope. And then another 11 died while the ship was at anchor at Table Bay, awaiting water and provisions. That reduced the number to 174. And then a strong gale from the northeast forced the brig to lose both of its anchors and its cables. And the ship then wrecked in Table Bay, and another 41 of the captives died. And that left 133 who remained. They were rescued and taken to the hospital at Cape Town, and there another 5 died. So when the officials inspected them, the surviving captives, they discovered that all 128 of those survivors had been branded with 2 letters, the letters CF, and at least 77 of them had that brand either on their right breast or on their right chest. And it was a mystery as I started looking through the records of this slave shipwreck, what those initials could have meant. But thankfully, there's a documentary chain that's created as a result of this shipwreck, and then the claims that were made to the enslaved Africans who survived that help us answer that question. And they connect to this bigger book project that I'm looking at. So the Paquete Real was the property of a master by the name of Souza, but the letters CF appear to actually relate to somebody else. So you can see the letters CF right here on some of those captives. 77 of them have been branded with those initials, with those letters. And the meanings of those initials might have been lost, except a Brazilian merchant submitted a written appeal for the return of his quote unquote property. Felipe Justanio Costa Ferreira, who was a slave trader from San Salvador, Bahia, enlisted a legal counsel from John Samuel Merrington, a notary in Cape Town, to appeal for the return of those 128 surviving African captives. Costa Ferreira, who is undoubtedly the namesake of those 2 letters that had been seared onto the flesh of those captives, submitted this appeal, and he knew at the time that 77 of those captives would have been bearing his initials on their right breast or on their right shoulder. And so he made that appeal. However, the supercargo of the Paquete Real, Jose Martins Gomez, then got permission from the governor to visit the hospital where those mostly children, remaining surviving captives, were then being kept. He was given permission to enter the hospital to inspect them. And we can only imagine the horror that was endured by those survivors, again, mostly children, as the supercargo of the ship, the one who most likely had been the one to brand them on their shoulder and on their chest, went into the hospital to actually look at them and inspect them, to have a look at their brands. And the governor's acquiescence to this request might reflect the tenuousness of the British-Portuguese treaty relations at the time, or the enduring appeal of arguments about quote-unquote slaves as property within the British Empire, despite the growing commitment to the cause of abolition. I use that story to introduce a broader project that I'm working on focused on the Indian Ocean world on liberated Africans. And as Henry has nicely pointed out, the term, of course, is of course really problematic, right? These people are not actually liberated. They're, for the most part, indentured. And I think Henry's spot on that what we're talking about is a global phenomenon of people using the cause of freedom and liberation to then indenture people and take advantage of the economic potential of their labor. So in the next few minutes, I want to talk to you a little bit about this unique group of people, and I think they really are unique, probably in all of world history. They experienced the horrors of enslavement, right, and the terror of being sent to an unknown destination in the holds of a slave ship, in appalling conditions in a middle passage, usually in a state of near or complete nakedness, in desperately cramped quarters. And then they experienced a second trauma, and that is the trauma of this so-called liberation, right? When their ships are captured on the high seas, often by the Royal Navy or others, as Henry has pointed out, in seizures that often involved violent resistance, and including gunfire. And then after capture, they're taken to equally unfamiliar places, often other places within the British Empire, that were equally unfamiliar to them. They were often then kept on board those slave ships until an admiralty court could adjudicate the legality of the ship's seizure under international law. And then those ships would be taken ashore and those people would then be registered. So often they were taken on board a British Royal Navy ship, as is the case in the 1860s, in cases in the Red Sea and in the Indian Ocean, like this one from 1868 aboard the HMS Daphne. And often, if you've seen photographs of groups of African captives seized on the high seas aboard slave ships, they're not from the Atlantic, they're from the Indian Ocean, because this sort of later phase of the global slave trade allowed for this kind of documentation. The 1860s photography existed, and so it was often used sometimes to take group or even individual photographs of captives. So as Henry mentioned, this is part of a much broader global trend, and of course the data from the Yale Atlas of Global Slavery has to now be completely revised thanks to Henry's hard work on this. But we're talking about, at least in the British Empire, between 200 and 250,000 people who were removed from slave ships in the 19th century, and about half of whom were then taken to Sierra Leone, and most of the others taken to places in the Caribbean or in Brazil. But at least 30,000 of them were also taken to port cities in the British Empire in the Indian Ocean. And those are the people who I'm particularly interested to study. So in some ways, as both Richard and Henry mentioned, this builds a little bit on my previous work. So I did a book back in 2015 that examined the history of the African diaspora in Arabia and the Gulf in the context of the globalizing effects of capitalism and the incorporation of pearl markets and date markets into global markets that included consumers in far off places like the United States and Europe. And so for that project, I was mostly working in East Africa and Arabia, centering my work on Zanzibar and Kilwa and Oman. And I was interested in the kind of labor that Africans were doing in things like pearl diving and in date productions. By contrast, this new project that I'm working on is interested in those slave voyages from East Africa to Arabia that never arrived, in part because their journeys were interrupted by the British Royal Navy, who then took them to far-off places like Mauritius or the Seychelles or the Cape of Good Hope. And so the stories that I'm interested in are the traumatic stories of these liberated Africans who experienced this traumatic experience, this extraordinary trauma of capture and then recapture, and then most often indenture. And those survivors, I argue, it's also demonstrated extraordinary resilience. And so, as Henry mentioned, the Royal Navy begins making these captures as early as 1808. And what's interesting is they're not only making these captures in the Caribbean and on the coast of West Africa, but they're also making them in the Indian Ocean, right off of the coast of the Cape of Good Hope. So the act of abolition itself envisioned indenture as sort of like a humanitarian act in order to train people in some sort of marketable skill that would then allow them to live an independent life. But practically, almost all of these people are indentured to really menial tasks that also mirrored enslavement. They were enlisted as domestic servants or enlisted as field hands, essentially working in plantations. The initial captures were in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, and using the law of war, international law of war, they were considered prizes of war. The earliest captures at the Cape of Good Hope, people were taken to Cape Town or they were taken to Mauritius. And when those ships arrived at ports of adjudication, their cases were then heard at Vice Admiralty courts, as Henry mentioned. So they would be heard at places like Mauritius, the Vice Admiralty court there, or the Cape of Good Hope. These ships would be captured on the high seas, just as in the Atlantic. But there would also then be a court case, and that could take place, as Henry mentioned, in Zanzibar, as a Vice Admiralty court that was created there. Vice Admiralty courts were later created at Aden. And so after firing warning shots and trying to get these ships to stop, sometimes they would fire live rounds. So there are cases in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea where the live rounds actually hit the enslaved people who they're ostensibly, they're alleged to be attempting to free. And there are many tragic cases in which these ships try to outrun those British cruisers, often running aground, knowing that there's no jurisdiction once they're on board, and often the Royal Navy will give up. These ships involved European slave ships, especially in the earlier periods, before around 1860. But after about 1860, they're almost exclusively Arab dhows, primarily from Eastern Arabia. Sometimes they would be boarded, and then those captives would be put aboard the Royal Navy ship before the ship in the Indian Ocean. Usually these ships are fired at sea, they're destroyed at sea, and they're deemed to be unseaworthy. This allows the Royal Navy to then take measurements, which sometimes can be exaggerated in order to get prize money, not only the head money for the captives on board, but also for the tonnage of the ship. Here's a photograph from Zanzibar of a group of captives on board of a slave ship that's being boarded by the Royal Navy there at Zanzibar. Sometimes, as I mentioned, the ships would run ashore, where the Royal Navy often would not pursue them because they didn't have jurisdiction on land. And often the slave traders would manage to capture as many people as possible, only to then re-enslave them and re-ship them later. And then a trial would happen. So at Zanzibar, this would involve the consul serving as one of the commissioners on the Vice Admiralty Court, and they would include interviews with people who are on board. Sometimes an interpreter would be brought in to interview the slave traders themselves, the enslaved people themselves, and of course the officers and crew of the ships that made the capture in order to be documented. All of this was part of a legal process to then indenture those people. They would be taken where their labor could then be exploited at places like the Seychelles or Mauritius or the Cape of Good Hope. But a key part of this process, as Henry points out, is the process of registration, of listing people individually, not only their names and ages, but often hints at perhaps their origins or ethnicities. This could include marks like facial scarification or body modification, tattoos, and also brands. And these give us some clues about these people's origins and where they came from, and then also sometimes hints at claims of ownership, like the initials CF that had been burned onto the flesh of those captives at the Cape of Good Hope. But sometimes they give very careful descriptions at Mauritius and the Cape of Good Hope in particular of what the scarification looks like. And those could point to hints about where they're from. So in particular, places in Mozambique that used very particular patterns of facial scarification. And then, of course, they would be indentured. And so here is an indenture from the Cape of Good Hope. But these people at the Cape of Good Hope and a few hundred who were also taken to Durban, and then several thousand were taken to Mauritius, often did work alongside in some of the same plantations as indentured people from South Asia. So all in all, in the Indian Ocean, liberated Africans who were captured on the high seas by the British Royal Navy were taken to 7 main places and then at least 3 other tertiary places. The big places were Cape Town and Mauritius in the early years, and then later Zanzibar, Mombasa, the Seychelles after the 1860s, particularly the 1870s, but also Bombay, a few to Muscat and to Aden. And to this list, we also need to add Suakin on the Red Sea coast as well. In the early years, the numbers were concentrated around Cape Town and Mauritius. And my colleague Satyendra Peertham, who I believe is attending today, has done some of the most extensive work on Mauritius. And another colleague, Clara Boyer has been working on a group of captives who were taken to Mauritius in 1840. And of course, Sue Peabody's done some really interesting work on another slave ship that was captured and taken to Mauritius in 1825. In the later period, in the period that does overlap with the period of South Asian indenture in the British Empire, the numbers are also quite large around the Cape of Good Hope and in Mauritius. And particularly after 1860s, we have large numbers of people who are taken to the islands of the Seychelles, as well as to places like Zanzibar, as Henry mentioned. And then in an earlier period, the Indian Navy and the Bombay Marine would take captives to Bombay. So some of the most important work on this subject has been published in one of our other presenters, served as one of the primary editors of this. So Henry Lovejoy and Richard Anderson edited this volume on liberated Africans and the abolition of the slave trade. And so I've got one chapter in that, but the whole volume is worth having a look at. And we should really commend Henry and Richard for their excellent work on this. So some of the process of doing this research has taken me to archives around the Indian Ocean to try to track down what are referred to as the registers of liberated Africans. And registers like this one at Cape Town give us a window into what life might have been like for these captives as they're released, at least in part because some of these, of the collectors of customs, who are the people who are tasked with indenturing these recaptives, took great care, took great pains to describe not just the brands that appeared on people's skin, but also patterns of facial scarification and body modification. And some of these give us an idea of where people might have been from. And so some particular patterns from Mozambique that are described with great care in Cape Town and also in Mauritius could be compared with 19th century ethnographies. And can give us a hint at what particular ethnic groups in Mozambique, which use patterns of facial scarification, might actually line up with some of these very carefully done drawings. So there's a couple of collectors of customs at the Cape of Good Hope, a gentleman by the name of William Swan Field, who is very particular. And he's open about why he is particular. These registers served as a method of surveillance. People would often abscond from their indenture and run away. And so he considered this a loathsome but also essential part of his work in looking at people and carefully drawing the facial scarification, because people often didn't like the person they were indentured to and often would run away. And so they might claim a new identity, and then these registers could be used as sort of like an early form of a passport in an era before photography, where the people could be distinguished from one another, and so false claims could be administered. And there are certain ethnic groups that we know were using particular patterns of scarification, and they've been studied not only in the African context, but also in the Brazilian contexts. So in Guindo and other ethnic groups in this part of Mozambique used patterns of facial scarification that we find in places where they were enslaved, including Brazil. As well as at the Cape of Good Hope, and can give us a window into where they originated. Some of the most fascinating registers are the ones that come from the Seychelles. Beginning in 1861, liberated Africans captured on the high seas in Indian Ocean were taken to the Seychelles, where they were not only listed in these registers, but also individually photographed. And so these photographs include often very haunting images of children. And sometimes if you look carefully, you can see the chair that they're seated on, get an idea of how small they really were. But they are individually numbered and registered, and then they even had a more accurate form of surveillance in the form of actual individual photos, like mugshots that were taken. And by the way, the lines going through these indicate people who have since died. So these 10 locations around the Indian Ocean are places where I'm trying to do primary source research and try to uncover the registers, because the registers give us a window into what life might have been like for these people, the people who they would have worked alongside, including South Asian Indian indentured laborers, who they would have worked for. In the contracts that I've seen from places like Cape Town, you know precisely to whom they were indentured, and then that can give you an idea of where to look next. for any descendants or for records that might appear in the archival documentation of plantations or of individual merchants in places like Cape Town. So we can know something about the terms of these contracts, which were, as Richard pointed out, almost always in the Indian Ocean, almost always the full maximum allowable 14 years. But then occasionally we'll also find a document like this releasing somebody from their indenture, indicating that the full 14 years had been served and the person was now legally free. We can also find information about branding. So if somebody is listed in a register of having a brand, sometimes the documentation exists, but we can actually correspond those individual brands, the initials, to the merchants, very often Portuguese or Brazilian merchants from places like Rio de Janeiro. By looking carefully at these records, we can decipher the language of those brands. Other places like Mauritius is a place that might be of special interest to this organization and the people who are attending today, because in the 1830s, Mauritius was also the home of large numbers of Indian indentured laborers who would have worked alongside some of these liberated Africans who were placed into very similar indentures, often using the same stationery. So here is a blank indenture from the Mauritius archives. I'd like to thank Satyendra Peertham for directing me to this one. I believe Satyendra may be attending here. And I'll just mention a couple of quick stories about Mauritius because I think it may be of all the places where liberated Africans were taken in the Indian Ocean, one of the most interesting to this audience. This is a ship called the Manuela, which was captured by the HMS Brisk on August 10th, 1860 by a British Navy sloop of war patrolling the waters between Mozambique and Madagascar. It was a Cuban slave ship that was sailing from Zanzibar to Havana. The Brisk pursued and captured the slave ship, and on boarding discovered the Manuela had on board 846 African captives, which is one of the largest slave ships ever captured on the high seas and one of the largest in the Indian Ocean by large measure. The African captives were then relocated to Mauritius, where they became known as liberated Africans. But again, they're not released on the island to live independently. They're registered and then placed into indentures to work as laborers, domestic servants, or apprentices to trade for terms up to 14 years. So this is a ship that's captured around here and then taken to Mauritius, which makes sense, right? It's the closest port of adjudication. It wouldn't make much sense to take a ship captured here to the Cape of Good Hope, although often that did happen. In fact, just a couple of decades earlier, the horrifying case of the Progresso, which large numbers of people died before they could arrive at the Cape of Good Hope to be adjudicated. But there are very large captures in the Indian Ocean, but the Brisk's capture of the Manuela is certainly one of the biggest. But among those the survivors from ships like this, almost all are indentured into domestic servitude or to be plantation work hands, field hands. And so, although ostensibly the indenture is intended to be something that's training people for a marketable skill that will allow them to live independently, practically almost all these people are then indentured into menial tasks in indentured servitude, either in essentially looking like domestic slavery or even plantation slavery. The second indenture I want to show you comes from a ship by the name of the Aglaé, which was captured on the 31st of October, 1814 by a government schooner called the Magnet, which chased it up the coast. And the commander of the Magnet, George Ballard Vine, had actually seen John Salmon, the owner of the Aglaé, just a few months earlier. And John Salmon had actually dared Vine to try to catch the Aglaé. He hinted strongly that the ship was a slave ship and was involved in the slave trade. He said, if you meet with the Aglaé, it would be useless you're chasing her, as she would bid defiance to you. And so Vine must have had great satisfaction in capturing the ship. But when they inspected it, they found that stowed and covered and hidden in the hold of the ship were 160 enslaved Africans. 70 of the men were in chains, and there were 22 young women and at least 60 children, all in a state of perfect nakedness, the documents say. And the food stores were incredibly low, indicating the Aglaé probably intended to disembark those captives right on the coast around Flic-en-Flac, just north of Lemoore in Mauritius. And the Aglaé's papers confirmed that they had departed from Port Louis Harbor and then had gone toward Mozambique and Madagascar, and then were appearing now with these captives. So the Aglaé was taken into Port Louis and then to Reunion, but the enslaved Africans on board were given over, as was custom, to the Collector of Customs. And the Collector of Customs, Christopher Teasdale, then listed them individually in the record, recording their names and their sexes and all that, but also then indentured them primarily to British officials there on the island. And many of them were listed to be carpenters and blacksmiths and wheelwright, but for the most part, they're listed as laundresses and domestic servants. And I've showed you these images previously. So I'll skip now. I want to just mention briefly that some were also taken to Bombay. These are the ones who were captured by the Bombay Marine or by the Indian Navy. And these include some of probably the best traveled Africans anywhere in the world. These include people like Joseph Wainwright, who then accompanied the body of Livingston to England. Some of these people were then taken to the Nassau Asylum, which was a church missionary society mission to liberated Africans in Bombay. And these included some very famous Africans who would then later accompany European so-called explorers as they went around East Africa. These people were instructed in English, and so they also often spoke Kiswahili or other East African languages, and were very useful to European explorers as they traveled around East Africa. A good number were also taken to the Seychelles after 1861 with a series of captures made by this ship, the HMS Lyra. And this is the place where large numbers were also photographed. And those photographs are preserved in the Seychelles archives, with the exception of just a few leaflets, which ended up in South Africa. Interestingly, connecting to the story of Livingston, after Stanley found Livingston and then was on his way back to New York to report his findings to the New York Herald, he stopped over in the Seychelles, and he actually witnessed some of these slave ships that were captured and were taken to the Seychelles. And he was appalled by the treatment. He thought that the British were essentially selling these captives as slaves. And he said as much on his way back. In London, he gave a speech which he basically accused the British of selling these captives as slaves. And so one response to this was the Church Missionary Society then built a new mission in the Seychelles. And they sent a very tall missionary out who wore a pith helmet to collect the captives, the youngest captives from various plantations, and deliver them to a new mission that they named called Venstown. And the ruins of Venstown are still there. And if you visit the Seychelles, you can ascend the mountains by car, and you can see the places where Venstown's ruins are to this day. Right. Other places where liberated Africans were taken, I mentioned Suakin. I unfortunately don't have any images to show you from Suakin, but a good number of the captives who were taken to Aden were photographed. And some were also handed over to a mission, a Scottish Free Church mission, which was then later relocated to Lovedale in South Africa. And so we have some images of those, but they are the subject of a book by Sandy Shell called Children of Hope, which I strongly encourage you all to have a look at. Well, I won't have time to go into much detail on any of the other locations, but I'll just conclude by mentioning a few things about some general trends that I've noticed as I've looked at the records from each of these places where liberated Africans were taken by the British Royal Navy in the 19th century. And one of those is the horrible mistreatment that these liberated Africans meet. Not only are they exploited for their labor by being indentured, but many of them are also experiencing abuse. Not just in the form of name calling, which is certainly the case for British Royal Navy officers, but often at the missions where they're taken around the Indian Ocean. some of these people are they're certainly some of the most vulnerable anywhere in the world, having been enslaved and then recaptured and then they're so alienated from their kin and any kind of legal recourse that they're often abused, and this happens certainly at some of the missions. And so Sandy Shell points out in her book that some of these African captives who were taken initially to Aden and then relocated to Lovedale in South Africa are at a mission with Matthew Lockhead, who's seated here and depicted alongside some of these captives. And you can see that his image will later be razored out very crudely and then replaced with the founder of the Lovedale mission, another image. And she suggests, I think correctly, that this is evidence that some of these children were abused by one of these missionaries. And I've certainly seen records from the other missions, other CMS missions in the Indian Ocean, where abuse did take place. That's certainly the case at Freetown in Mombasa, where there's some horrifying cases of liberated Africans who are actually physically beaten by one of the lay missionaries there. And they're being described as, appearing to give testimony in their Sunday best, but then when they turn around and show their backs, they've been beaten by thorny sticks by a Scottish lay missionary who was intended to be instructing them in industrial skills, and instead was actually beating them, he said, because it was the only way to get them to confess to their alleged crimes. So in the larger project, I'm interested in this abuse, but also in the general treatment of liberated Africans by British officials. And I'm interested in the intersection of race and into anti-slavery and imperialism in this age of sort of late abolition. By the 19th century, I argue the callous treatment of liberated Africans reflected the growing influence of scientific racism and a pessimism about the project of abolition itself. And so I'm interested to see how new theories of scientific racism influence the treatment of liberated Africans, whose numbers in the Indian Ocean swelled in the years after 1860, and the treatment that they received from imperial officials and missionaries and naval officers, how they reflected the perceptions of those that were being actively shaped by scientific debates about race and human difference back home. And I'll leave it with that.
Another fascinating presentation. Thank you very much, sir. I just want to follow on your comment with a comment here from Ela Gandhi, the granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi. She's in South Africa. She says, we need to ensure that exploitation and slavery eventually ends, suggesting it continues today. We also have a comment here from Dr. Betty Govindan from South Africa. This program is excellent because we need to see the intersections in our histories. I totally agree. We have Dr. Yvonne Bob Smith from right here in Trinidad, who agrees we need to see the interconnectedness, and we have to mandate cultural heritage education in schools, because a lot of what you all have shared today is unknown. And so it does indeed raise some questions. And at this point, I want to open the floor. We will take questions and comments from members of the live audience, as well as from those of you who are on YouTube. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and we will pose these questions to our speakers on your behalf. Dr. Joy Mahbir of New York is asking, how were African indentured laborers recruited, especially from St. Helena, to the British Caribbean?
I can certainly answer that question. So following the work of Andrew Pearson, who has done an extensive study on the lives of liberated Africans, especially in St. Helena, this history really ties into the bilateral anti-slave trade treaties. So I'm not talking about the first round of them that happened just after the Napoleonic Wars, but because those treaties essentially prohibited the British Navy from capturing slave ships south of the equator. So especially after the Napoleonic Wars, so the early captures in South Africa happened in the context of the Napoleonic Wars, so they're capturing enemy ships by and large. And then once these legislative processes came in, they prevented the British from capturing south of the equator. So in 1835 with Spain, and I think in 1842 with Portugal, they changed the laws, these bilateral treaties, to include two new features to them. First was the equipment clause, which allowed them to capture slave ships without people on board. So if they had supplies and equipment that were indicative of the slave trade, like lots of water casks, iron shackles, amounts of food, stuff like this, they could condemn the slave ship without people on board. And they started doing that really after the 1830s. And then in that process, they also opened up south of the equator. So the blockade of the slave trade, which was primarily focused north of the equator before 1835, and a majority of people went to Sierra Leone, it suddenly shifted and St. Helena became a main base for the British. The majority of people who went to St. Helena would have come from West Central Africa, particularly Angola, and a few other places in East Africa as well. And St. Helena really served as what is called an entrepot colony. So they'd bring liberated Africans in and then ship them to the British Caribbean. So there wasn't a huge liberated African community on St. Helena. There was to a certain extent, especially as Indian indentured laborers came into St. Helena a little bit later. And Andrew Pearson is an archaeologist, and he's done a lot of work sort of uncovering the graves of liberated Africans because they wanted to build an airport on St. Helena. And St. Helena, of course, is most famous because that's where Napoleon was exiled to. So it really happened after 1835, and it just served as a place to sort of liberate them at the Vice Admiralty Court there and then send them to the British Caribbean.
Thank you for that. Earlier, as we have you on right now, earlier you made reference to, you said liberated Africans, slavery without a name persists beyond the 1920s. And I just wondered what evidence exists about the conditions under which they worked. Were they working?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this goes to Duffy's book from Before Curtain for the historian buffs in here, who really sort of began unpacking a lot of the Portuguese indentured labor migration in a big chunk of his book. And he has figures in that book that show that these trends of liberating people on land in the Portuguese colonies, Cabo Verde, Angola, and Mozambique, and then shipping them to San Tomé and Principe. And so we get these huge migrations. I mean, there's well over 116,000 people taken to the Gulf Islands, San Tomé and Principe, that extends into the 1920s. We also, I'm beginning to see as well different types of labor regimes within colonial Africa of different African societies and cultures who are using these different models of indentured labor as they're working through the different colonial governments to essentially free people from slavery within Africa and put them to work in different terminologies associated with different African language, like in Hausa land and other places, Sokoto Caliphate. So there's these different types of labor regimes that are building within Africa and colonial Africa that relate to it. One example, the Congo Free State, right? I mean, King Leopold II is telling everyone in Europe, this is a free state, and we all know what was happening there, which is sort of this genocide that's taking place as they're trying to extract a lot of rubber. I find it interesting that he's calling it the Congo Free State. So I think this is a build out of that humanitarian idea of liberated African to put it to a whole new colonial regime within Africa. And that's millions and millions of different people, right? And that certainly goes into the 20th century in different ways. And then as governments sort of after the world wars start pulling back and we get the UN Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and governments are really beginning to be shunned because of the Holocaust and different things like this, right? We're starting to see it privatize a lot more as different individuals, corporations, whatever types of child labor that take place thereafter. It's sort of, we get the shift into privatization again, and it's criminal. Most countries in the world consider it to be criminal. Mauritania being the last country in the world to sort of abolish slavery on a national level, which is in the 1980s, if you want to think of it that way.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. To all the speakers, you all please feel free to unmute your mics and jump in at any point in time. This is open forum. We really appreciate all the research that you all have presented today, and this is extraordinary information. So feel free to jump in at any point in time.
If I may.
Sorry, go ahead.
If I may, just two brief comments. The first is to come back and speak to Henry's point about the shipment of, for example, liberated Africans right from St. Helena and whatnot. And one of the things that needs to be done, right? And this brings me back to the larger issue of contextualization, is do we see, for example, increasing numbers of indentured Africans flowing into the Caribbean at precisely the same time that we have reductions in Indian immigration? I mean, we oftentimes assume, right, that Indian immigration was constant, but we know that it could indeed fluctuate wildly. And in fact, there are periods when it is suspended for various and sundry reasons. And the second point that I want to bring us back to is the problem of definition. English is an extraordinary rich language, right? More words than any other language. We have one word, slave, which carries an extraordinary amount of emotive baggage with it. And I mean, when we talk about slavery in the modern world, I'm immediately reminded of Kevin Bales and Siddharth Kara, right, who argue that slavery still exists. And so one of the questions that comes up is, when we use this term, what exactly do we mean by it? And I'm not trying to engage in, quibbling here, but it goes to the very heart, for example, of what is the difference between someone who is enslaved and an Indian immigrant who is indentured. And the people have made the point that, in fact, these individuals were treated in many respects, no worse than industrial workers, or as bad as industrial workers in Britain at exactly the same time. So I think this is one of these areas where we have to avoid the kind of simplistic, or maybe ultimately even reductionism with it that this topic automatically lends itself to. Because, of course, the question comes up in Africa when we talk about indenture, for example, in Angola, and here I plead my ignorance. I mean, are we dealing here with something which in one sense draws on African models of expectations in terms of how labor is mobilized and recruited and ultimately used? So the point that I want to emphasize here is, if we're going to talk about this, then let's be very careful about how we go about the business of characterizing indentured workers versus slaves. What do you do, for example, with the indentured or the Indian convicts who are shipped across the Indian Ocean and indeed throughout the world, as Claire Anderson has discussed? So let's appreciate and let's embrace this notion of being sensitive to these issues, because they automatically shape the kind of argument that we're going to be making.
Thank you very much for that, Professor Allen. And you've led me straight into this whole question of reparations. And I'd like a comment from each of our speakers, please. I'm sure you all are very familiar with the reparations debate. And so I'd like a comment from all of you all as to the eligibility of descendants of these liberated and indentured Africans to reparations. What do you think?
Sure, I can certainly start on this. I mean, I certainly think that governments knew what they were doing using these anti-slave trade legislation to create a new involuntary labor force. So I think Richard Allen's comments on the definitions of these terms is incredibly important. These are what governments were doing based on law. Sorting out reparations, as we all know, is a very difficult problem, not only because figuring out who is eligible and who may not be, all of these sort of things. I think the registers of liberated Africans can play a huge and important role, especially as they do in places like Mauritius for indentured laborers and immigration and other places like that. Other themes beyond just kind of monetary compensations or anything like this. But I also think for the Caribbean as a whole, which is largely considered underdeveloped compared to, say, European nations and other things like that, there's this disparity of wealth that is occurring as a result of all of it. So I think our research helps identify some of these key problems, the way in which governments were misleading their people back home by calling these people liberated Africans, emancipados, libertos, serviçais, Balanda Hitam, and the list goes on and on and on within the different structures of legislation that emerged out of these periods. So I think it's a very difficult problem. I don't think I have a direct answer on how the direct descendants of liberated Africans would receive reparations. I think that's up to governments to decide, but I hope the research does further the debate in different ways.
Very good. Thank
I'll
you so much
agree.
for that. Yes, Professor Allen.
I'll agree totally with Henry that this is an incredibly complex, problematic topic, and made more so because, of course, one must move away from the assumption that it's only going to be Europeans, right, who necessarily employ slaves or indentured workers. What do you do, for example, in the case of Mauritius, where you have gens de couleur libre, right, who can be of Malagasy or Indian or mixed ancestry, who own slaves or employ indentured laborers? It just again underscores the complexity here. And I think an integral part of this is that to what extent and in what ways do early 21st century sensitivities and sensibilities distort what was going on in the past? I mean, we need to remember, right, that slave ownership in the minds of many people in the 17th and 18th and 19th century was perfectly legitimate, perfectly legal, right? Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. We now condemn it, and justly so. So I guess it brings us back to the question of what do we mean by reparations? Are we talking exclusively about financial compensation of some kind? Or are we dealing here with governments adopting measures which are targeted towards all disadvantaged populations to assist them to lead a better quality of life? I was involved with the Mauritius Truth and Justice Commission, and I know this was an issue that we debated. So there's no simple answer. And I think, again, the notion that if you have a better sense of what happened in the past and why it happened the way that it did, that this can certainly help frame your considerations of how best to deal with this. I'm reminded here many years ago, I had good fortune of meeting the late Joe Miller at an international conference. And he'd just come back, this was 1994, and he'd just come back from a conference in West Africa about slavery. And he reported to me that he'd heard something which was really quite remarkable for the day and the age. And that was that he'd had an African historian admit to him that when it came to the question of slavery, quote, everybody's hands were dirty. How many hands are dirty? So I leave it there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Professor Hopper, please comment.
I don't have a whole lot to add to those comments, except it seems to me when pressured, people who are resistant to the idea of reparations often invoke sort of mysteriousness of the past, sort of it's so long ago and how can we really know who is truly involved? And I think that's why some of the documentary research that those of us who are working on Liberated Africans, with especially the registers, I think can really help cast the light on, right? Because here really is a way where you can not only know people's names, but other details about them, but then also know who actually was laying claims of ownership to them, right? Particularly in the form of the brands. If we can decipher the language of those marks, and know something about who is actually laying claim to ownership, I think that's the way we can actually be quite precise. So if somebody says, well, how can we really know? I think we can show them registry and say, well, here's a way, right? Show them the documentation to decipher the meanings of those marks. Well, here is a way, and we actually can make these connections. I think the only thing that maybe remains to be said is that I think in terms of contemporary nation states dealing with reparations, we don't have a lot of examples, right? But in terms of internment in in California of Japanese populations during the Second World War, and also in terms of the Holocaust, I think it's actually been quite therapeutic for states to grapple with the issues of reparation, even if the monetary amounts are trifling or small. I think there's something therapeutic, something cathartic about a state dealing with its past. And I think that actually we often discount or maybe forget that actually could be quite a good thing for a state to acknowledge its historical wrongdoings and come to grips with it in some way, as has happened in Germany with Holocaust survivors. That the monetary amounts are actually they're not insignificant, but they're not enormous. But therapeutic in terms of the cathartic or therapeutic value, I think is it's not something to discount.
Thank you very much for that. And the final question to you all, this comes from Professor Dabadine, who wants to know what are the topics of scholarship needed to further the study of liberated Africans and indentured Africans? Any response?
Yes. Part of this is that we need to probe beneath the surface, right, of what happens to these individuals in the individual colonies or other places where they end up living. I mean, as I mentioned to you before, we don't really know what happened to them upon completion of their indenture, because this is a non-issue as most indentured labor historians are concerned. So the key here, and I understand the difficulties of doing so, but innovative use can be made of existing records to really probe beneath the surface and find out what happens to these people after they've completed their indenture. I mean, I've done this work in Mauritius using an assortment of sources, and part of this is to also engage in a deliberately comparative study to find out the ways in which and the extent to which the African indentured experience in one colony may be similar to or different from that in other colonies, which raises the question of how and why is that so? So it brings me back to, as far as I'm concerned, to the issue that we need to dramatically expand our conceptual horizons. We need to begin to ask a whole new series of questions. We need to try to address them insofar as the archival record and other sources of information, such as oral tradition and history, will allow us to do. But so long as we remain stuck, preoccupied with the same old topics, we're never going to advance the course of indentured labor studies in any kind of significant way. I just published an essay in the most recent Slavery and Abolition, reflecting upon the legacy of Hugh Tinker's A New System of Slavery. And the point that I made there is that if you go back and you take a look at the publication of Philip Curtin's classic Census of the Atlantic, he challenged people to go out and prove him right or prove him wrong about the number of Africans being transported across the Atlantic. Indentured labor studies, unfortunately, tends to be stuck in dealing with the same old tired issues that have preoccupied people since the mid-1970s. And we really do need to move the marker. We need to move the dial to begin to coming to grips in very conscious and realistic ways with these kinds of issues, because so long as we don't talk about them, we'll never know. And our knowledge and understanding of the indentured experience and all of its complexity will remain truncated. And as I mentioned, I think ultimately you end up with a distorted picture. If we're serious about respecting and honoring, right, these millions of individuals and honoring their memory, don't they deserve to have the full nature of their experience being brought to light so that we can appreciate in very clear and unequivocal terms why they should be important, not just simply to their immediate families or their localities or their nations, but in terms of helping us to understand why and how the modern world as we know it in the early 21st century exists.
Excellent. Thank you. Go ahead, please, Professor Lovejoy.
Yeah, so I mean, building exactly on what Richard has just said, I think one, digital technologies, I think, are really helping us facilitate this in new and exciting ways, because keeping track of all of the registered liberated Africans or all of the indentured laborers from Asia and putting them into vast data sets that can be researched not just by scholars, but across a broad public. I mean, you can go onto Liberated Africans now and look at the different case files, looking at these different things to be able to better tabulate them. So in a certain sense, doing what Curtin did in the 1960s with his census is the same inspiration I got from him to begin to build this global data set, right? That now challenges what we've been thinking about it. There is a significant gap in terms of understanding that there was 250,000 versus 700,000 people. And if now 700,000 is the base minimum, I hope it challenges people to find more, because I believe and firmly believe that there's different ways to interpret what it was meant to be an involuntary indentured laborer, whether African, Asian, European, whatever it could have been. And this is sort of the way we need to reconceptualize all of these terminologies, because if we treat liberated African at face value, that term alone is so highly misleading that people believed and still believe that these people were freed. They were not freed. They were forced to work. And in many circumstances, the documentation shows that it was the same as or worse than slavery, depending on circumstances, regions, areas, time periods. There's resistance associated with it. There's colonization attributed to it through education. It's a very complex process that we need to move beyond the face value of what we are talking about. We need to understand the scale and scope of it. So that's why I think building data sets, putting them online, getting the documentation, and decolonizing the archive according to what is meant by these misleading terms. And because the archives are difficult to understand, because say in a given year, there's 10 slave ships that are captured, they go to different places. Those files are scattered across multiple global archives, which are increasingly becoming digitized and available online. But the reorganization of the colonial archives is now the next step, in my opinion, cataloging the individual documents so that we can take the deck of cards that is shuffled up around the world and begin organizing it and putting all of the kings with the kings and the queens with the queens and moving it along so that it becomes more searchable and understandable, not just for scholars, but for the general public. Thank you.
Has any of the information in your data set come from the colonies?
Absolutely. I've used archives from Cuba to Brazil, across the British Caribbean through the Adam Matthews digital collection that they have. I've used the Qatar Digital Archive. I've used a large amount of digitized resources that sometimes have been shared to me by private collections of digitized sources. Like Matt Hopper has shared a lot of information with me, to reevaluate different types of things, parliamentary papers. So absolutely, it spans all over the place. I've employed graduate students in different places, such as South Africa or other places within Africa. So there's a large sharing of information that's out there. The Harriet Tubman Institute, Brazilian scholars of Africa, Portugal and Africa. I've raised funding to go to these different
Very,
all over
very
the
similar,
place.
very original.
There's
All right.
lists and lists and lists of all of these people and where they are, and it's really important to do a full survey of it in
Mhm.
global perspective.
I may have missed it, and forgive me if I did from any of the presentations. Did any of you all have a specimen of an actual contract, indentureship contract, African indentureship contract?
Yeah, definitely. Those have been, a lot of those have been preserved at the Cape of Good Hope and Mauritius. I think if I would just add sort of to the question of, future horizons for further research, the two areas I would stress would be biography and genealogy. I think we need to know more about the lives of individuals. So that's why I think the work by some of these scholars of Mauritius, like Satyendra Peertham and Claire Boyer, is so important. Getting to know what the lives are like for the individuals and something more biographical about the people who have been involved in this process, I think is going to be really key. But I also would stress like what would be the role of genealogy. Given the amount of research that's currently being done with these registers, it's not impossible to imagine a world in which we might be able to find marriage and birth and death records of individuals who can allow us to trace the lives of people who are in these registers to living descendants, and then connecting with those descendants or descendant communities today. I think it's going to be really key in thinking through the ethics, of what it means to be, finding these 19th century names and bringing them out to global audiences. What does it mean to the people who are descended from those individuals, and what do they have to say about that experience? Maybe they have some knowledge through oral tradition, through oral history, or maybe it'll be completely new to them. I think it would be exciting, to connect with people who are the living descendants of some of the people who are in those registers. For me, that's really exciting. And I think the last thing is, interrogating some more this question. And Richard pointed out, and Henry both mentioned, the second slavery and the notion of indenture as just another form of slavery. I think that's an important idea to also contextualize and to interrogate, because certainly the case of the ship I mentioned, the Aglaé, from the early 19th century, even as early as 1814, being a liberated African is seen locally in Mauritius as clearly distinct from being enslaved. And so it is the case that their labor is being exploited in coercive ways. But it is also seen locally as distinct from slavery, to the extent that people are running away from slavery and presenting themselves as newly imported African slaves in order to be enlisted as liberated Africans. In other words, that's a more desirable position than being enslaved. So although their labor is being exploited in coercive ways, it's clearly seen as distinct at the time from slavery. So we should, I think, keep that in mind and interrogate too, how do people understand their own positionality in these colonial contexts? Because it was seen as distinct from slavery. We should keep that in mind, even though it is clearly a form of coercive labor that looks a lot like slavery to us. To them, there was a distinction, right? To the extent that people would claim that status, even though legally it wasn't their status, right? It was seen as a more desirable status. So I think we should keep that in mind as well.
I just want to add on that, Matthew, because I think it depends on place. And Emancipado in Cuba, which is a slave society, they actually became more stateless, not belonging to anyone. The government didn't want anything to do with them because it still supported slavery. So it became a less desirable position than perhaps in the examples that you've been given. And those people were treated more harshly in many circumstances. There is a lot of, from the biographical information we know, this also happened in Brazil in different circumstances as well. So it really depends on place, because you're going to get these nuances based on the individual biographical experiences that happen. And then just one added thing with the contracts of indenture, these apprenticeships, some of them are, they were supposed to give out the full printed rules with the person's name and descriptions, but the registers of liberated Africans are the contracts of indenture. That's the government's record book of the contract. All of the examples that Matt gave about who the people were, their age, their sex, their height, their physical descriptions, this is so that they could identify the individual as an indentured laborer according to the government officials on the ground. And those were widely circulated, and those were the contracts of indenture. There is, if we're getting beyond the idea of liberated African as freedom, these are not lists of emancipated people. These are lists of indentured laborers, one by one, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And that's the evidence of the contracts. And they did not sign them. They did not agree to have their names put into them. It was done by a government representative according to anti-slave trade law, where the registration process was in many circumstances codified into the anti-slave trade law. And so if we're moving beyond liberated Africans, these books are not anything except the evidence of the contracts of involuntary indenture.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And even in the printed contracts that I was showing in my presentation, the Africans themselves don't appear except for just being named. They never sign those contracts. It's a signature on behalf of the collector of customs, and it's a signature on behalf of the person they're being indentured to, but they have no say in the matter. I think that's also important to keep in mind. I think that's spot on.
And they're cognizant of it happening as well. I have evidence from Cuba, other places, where they return years later because they knew their name was entered into a book.
As we're talking about this, I'm reminded once again of yet another of Joe Miller's wonderful observations in his 2012 book about slavery as a global problem. And when he says that we need to stop thinking in terms of definitional terms framed by the experience of enslavement in the Atlantic world, in the Euro-American context. And part of that, right, brings us back to what do we mean by the notion of freedom or liberty? And invariably, one of the questions that has to come up is to what extent and in what ways are we projecting our own cultural values into a decidedly non-Western context? This is true, right, when we start talking about the notion of abolition, especially, for example, in parts of Asia, where our Western-inspired, Enlightenment-inspired notion of liberty and freedom doesn't apply. It can be extraordinarily misleading. And so again, I know it's not the sort of thing that a lot of people want to hear. We have to embrace the messiness. I used to tell my students that if we're really, really, really honest with ourselves, we want things to be relatively simple. Black, white, right, left, north, south. But as someone who was trained initially in anthropology, had the good fortune to grow up overseas, and has been a participant in that most noble of disciplines, the Queen of the Humanities, for more than 50 years, I know that the only way in which we ever really try to come up with answers is when we willingly embrace that wonderful, marvelous, messy gray between the white and the black. If there's truth, that's where it's going to be found.
Professor Allen, you've given me so much food for thought there. And indeed, to Professor Lovejoy and Hopper, fantastic. Such an enlightening evening. I'm willing to go further, but I'm being prompted. Time. It's time to end. So the three of you, fantastic. I cannot thank you enough for your expertise and the knowledge that you all have shared with us. We certainly have a lot more to dwell on as a result. Thank you very, very much. And at this point in time, I'll turn you all over now to Shakira. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalama, and we want to thank all our speakers. It was indeed a very fascinating program. As we've said earlier, this public meeting is being hosted by the Indo-Caribbean Cultural Center, and today we are pleased to have partnered with the Amina Ghafoor Institute for the study of indentureship and its legacies, led by Professor David Davidine, and this session is in honor of Amina Ghafoor and her husband, Satara Ghafoor. And you can feel free to contact the ICC to publish your books. And our topic next Sunday will be the launch of the conference and tour of South Africa to take place in August this year. So we want to thank the advisory and planning team led by Dr. Kumar Mahabir. Please visit, like, and subscribe to our YouTube channel to see all our past recordings. I am Shakira Mohammed of Trinidad and Tobago saying goodbye. May God bless you all. Dhanyavad.